The look on Marcus's face when I opened the front door to reveal his other wife, standing beside me, was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this moment. "Surprise, darling," I said, my voice steady as granite, while his world crumbled around him. "I'd like you to meet Rebecca Chen Williams. She has some very interesting stories to share about your business trips to Portland. But let me take you back to where this all began. Because what happened on my doorstep that Tuesday evening wasn't just revenge, it was the culmination of 6 months of detective work, careful orchestration, and a discovery so shattering, it rewrote everything I thought I knew about the man I'd shared a bed with for 9 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in our pristine suburban home in Willowbrook Heights. I was standing in our granite-countered kitchen, steam rising from my coffee mug as I watched Marcus gather his leather briefcase and check his phone with the practiced efficiency of a man who had his routine down to a science. He wore his charcoal gray suit, the expensive one from that boutique in the city, and his silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 42, Marcus Chen still carried himself with the confidence that had first attracted me when we met at a medical conference in Boston, nearly a decade ago. "Another exciting week in pharmaceutical sales," he said, kissing my cheek with the same perfunctory affection he'd shown for the past 2 years. His cologne, that woodsy scent I'd bought him for Christmas, lingered in the air after he pulled away. "Portland again?" I asked, not looking up from the financial section of the newspaper I'd spread across our breakfast bar. It was a calculated casualness, the kind of disinterested questioning that wives develop when their husbands travel frequently for work. "3 days this time," Marcus replied, already moving toward the garage door. "Big presentation for Northwest Regional Medical. You know how these hospital systems can be. Lots of meetings, lots of handshaking." He paused at the threshold, briefcase in one hand, travel coffee mug in the other. "I'll probably be working late each night, so don't wait up if I don't call until after 9. I nodded and smiled, the same understanding expression I'd perfected over countless similar conversations. "Drive safely. I love you." The words came automatically, a married woman's muscle memory, though I wondered when they'd started feeling more like habit than truth. Marcus had been taking these Portland trips monthly for almost 2 years now, always returning with stories about difficult clients and long dinners with hospital administrators. The routine had become so normal that I'd stopped questioning it, stopped feeling the small pang of loneliness that used to accompany his departures. After his car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I settled into my own morning ritual. As a freelance medical writer, I had the luxury of working from home, creating educational materials for healthcare providers and pharmaceutical companies. It was work that utilized my background in biomedical research while allowing me the flexibility that Marcus's travel schedule demanded. Our house, a colonial revival with cream-colored siding and black shutters, became my sanctuary during his absences. I'd converted the spare bedroom into an office, complete with dual monitors and a view of our backyard garden where I could watch the seasons change through tall windows. That Tuesday morning, I was reviewing a draft article about new diabetes treatments when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code caught my attention. Portland, Oregon. In 9 years of Marcus's business travels, I'd never received a call from one of his work contacts. My finger hovered over the decline button before curiosity won out. "Hello?" I answered, my voice carrying the cautious politeness reserved for unknown callers. "Hi, I'm looking for Marcus Chen," a woman's voice said. She sounded young, maybe early 30s, with a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. "This is the number he gave me for emergencies, but I think I might have dialed wrong." "Marcus is my husband," I said slowly, a strange chill beginning to form in my stomach. "He's traveling for work today. Can I take a message?" There was a long pause, the kind of silence that feels heavy with unspoken complications. "Your husband," the woman repeated, her voice climbing an octave. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some mistake. Marcus Chen isn't married. We've been together for 3 years. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the suddenly too quiet house. Brown liquid spread across the wood like a stain I'd never be able to fully clean. "Excuse me," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "Oh my God," the woman whispered, and I could hear the dawning horror in her tone. "Oh my God, you're serious. You really are married to him." "I'm Rebecca. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was shaking. "I thought I was Rebecca Chen because we got married last year in a small ceremony." He said he didn't have any family, that his parents were dead, that he'd been alone until he met me. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white, trying to anchor myself to something solid, while my entire reality shifted beneath my feet. "You're married to Marcus," I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "In Portland," Rebecca confirmed, her breathing audible through the phone. "We have a house together, a life. I'm pregnant." The last words came out as barely a whisper, carrying the weight of a revelation that shattered everything I thought I knew about my husband, my marriage, my life. I slid down the kitchen cabinet until I was sitting on the floor, staring at the spilled coffee that had begun to seep between the floorboards. "How far along?" I heard myself ask, though I couldn't understand why that detail mattered in the face of such overwhelming betrayal. "4 months," Rebecca said, and I could hear her crying now. "We've been trying for 2 years. Marcus was so excited when we found out. He's already started converting the spare room into a nursery." She paused, struggling to compose herself. "I found your number in his phone when I was looking for his doctor's contact. He had a minor accident at work yesterday, nothing serious, but I wanted to call his emergency contact. That's when I saw your name listed as his wife." Marcus had 2 wives. The thought was so absurd, so incomprehensible, that my mind struggled to process it. While I'd been living my quiet suburban life, believing my husband was simply a dedicated pharmaceutical sales representative who traveled frequently for work, he'd been building an entirely separate existence 3 states away, another house, another wife, another life, where I didn't exist. "Rebecca," I said, finally, my voice steadier than I felt, "I think we need to talk. In person." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Rebecca Chen, who'd believed herself to be Rebecca Chen, legally, was a registered nurse at Portland General Hospital. She'd met Marcus in the hospital cafeteria during one of his sales visits, been charmed by his stories about building a new life after losing his family in a car accident. The lie was so elaborate, so detailed, that even now I found myself impressed by its construction. Marcus had told her his parents and only sister had died when a drunk driver hit their car during a family vacation. He'd shown her fabricated death certificates, fake funeral programs, even photographs of graves that he'd claimed to visit on the anniversary of their death. To Rebecca, Marcus wasn't a man with a wife and established life in Connecticut. He was a grieving widower who'd thrown himself into work to cope with unimaginable loss, someone who'd been afraid to love again until he met her. Their courtship had been careful, patient, built on a foundation of shared trauma and mutual healing. She'd helped him through what she believed were grief episodes, supported him through the bad days when he claimed the memories became too much to bear. "He told me he'd never been married before," Rebecca said, her voice hollow with the shock of discovery. "Said he'd focused so much on his career that he'd never found the right person until me. We have wedding photos, a marriage certificate, joint bank account. How is that even possible if he's already married to you?" I was wondering the same thing. Bigamy was a federal crime, yet Marcus had somehow managed to maintain 2 legal marriages across state lines. As Rebecca described their life together, I began to understand the scope of his deception. He wasn't just cheating, he was living completely separate existences, with different identities, different histories, different futures planned with each of us. The Portland Marcus was a man rebuilding his life after tragedy, someone who worked hard during the week but spent weekends hiking with his wife, planning for their future children, talking about growing old together in their craftsman-style house, overlooking the Willamette River. The Connecticut Marcus was a successful sales representative, married to a medical writer, someone who enjoyed quiet evenings at home, weekend trips to New York City, and had been gently deflecting my questions about starting a family for the past 3 years. "I need to see you," I told Rebecca, as our conversation wound down. "I need to understand how extensive this is, what else he might be hiding." "Are you willing to meet?" Rebecca's answer came without hesitation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'll fly out tomorrow. I need to see your marriage certificate, your house, your life with him. I need to understand how someone can be married to two people at the same time without either of us knowing. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the wreckage of my spilled coffee and shattered assumptions, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. 9 years of marriage, 9 years of what I'd believed was a solid, if sometimes distant relationship, and it had all been an elaborate performance. Every business trip, every late-night phone call he'd taken in another room, every time he'd seemed distracted or unavailable, it all took on new meaning now. I thought about the way Marcus had always been vague about his Portland work, how he'd discouraged me from joining him on business trips, claiming the schedule was too demanding, and I'd be bored sitting alone in hotel rooms. I remembered the separate credit card he'd insisted on for business expenses, the private phone line he'd said was necessary for work calls, the way he'd become protective of his laptop and phone over the past few years. The signs had been there. I realized now I'd simply trusted my husband enough to accept his explanations, to respect his privacy, to believe that his increasing distance was just the natural evolution of a long marriage, rather than evidence of a double life. The Marcus I'd been married to was essentially a part-time husband, present physically but emotionally invested elsewhere. I'd attributed his distraction to work stress, his lack of interest in planning our future to his practical nature, his reluctance to discuss children to career focus. Now I understood that Connecticut Marcus couldn't plan a future with me because his real future was being built with Rebecca in Portland. He couldn't fully commit to having children with me because he was already expecting a child with his other wife. Every conversation about our relationship's direction had been deflected because he was already living the life I wanted, just not with me. The betrayal was so complete, so systematic, that I found myself almost admiring its scope even as it destroyed me. Marcus hadn't simply had an affair, he'd created an entirely parallel existence. He'd managed to love, marry and plan a family with another woman while maintaining the facade of a committed marriage with me. The logistical complexity alone was staggering. How had he managed 2 households, 2 sets of responsibilities, 2 emotional relationships without either of us discovering the truth? As the initial shock began to fade, replaced by a growing anger that felt like ice in my veins, I realized that Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated both of his wives. He'd assumed that Rebecca would never have reason to call his emergency contact, that I would never question his travel patterns deeply enough to discover the truth. He'd built his deception on the assumption that we were both too trusting, too dependent on him, too isolated from his other life to ever connect the dots. But now we knew about each other, and Marcus had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. I spent the rest of that Tuesday in a strange state of suspended animation, moving through the motions of my normal routine while my mind raced with questions and possibilities. I tried to work on my diabetes article, but the words on the screen seemed meaningless compared to the revelation that my entire marriage was a fraud. I made lunch but couldn't taste it, answered emails with responses that felt like they came from someone else, watered my garden while my thoughts spun in endless circles. Every object in our house took on new significance now. The framed wedding photos on our mantelpiece had Marcus displayed similar photos in his Portland home with Rebecca. The king-sized bed we shared. Did he have another bed, another bedroom, another intimate space that belonged to his other life? I found myself cataloging our possessions, wondering which items had duplicates in Portland, which aspects of our life together were unique, and which were simply props in an elaborate performance. The cruelest part was recognizing how well Marcus had played each role. With me, he was the steady, reliable husband who preferred quiet evenings at home and carefully managed our joint finances. With Rebecca, according to her description, he was the romantically wounded man, learning to love again, someone who embraced adventure and spontaneity as part of his healing process. Both versions felt authentic because Marcus had tailored each identity to appeal to what he perceived as our individual needs and desires. I'd fallen in love with stable, dependable Marcus because my previous relationships had been with unreliable men who couldn't commit to anything long-term. Rebecca had been drawn to vulnerable, recovering Marcus because her nursing instincts responded to someone who needed healing and support. He'd read us both perfectly, crafted himself into exactly what each of us was looking for, and maintained both personas for years without either character feeling forced or false. That evening, as I sat in our living room waiting for Marcus to call with his usual check-in from Portland, I realized I was about to become someone I'd never been before, a woman with a secret, a woman with a plan, a woman who could match her husband's capacity for deception. The trusting wife who'd accepted his explanations without question was gone, replaced by someone harder, more calculating, someone capable of the kind of strategic thinking that Marcus had been using against me for years. When his call came at 9:15, his voice carried its usual blend of tiredness and affection. "Hi, sweetheart. Just wanted to let you know I made it safely. The presentation went well today, though these doctors ask tough questions." "I'm glad it went smoothly," I replied, marveling at how easily the lie came. "Are you getting settled in your hotel?" "Finally, yes. Long day of meetings, and tomorrow looks just as packed. The regional director wants to extend our discussion into Thursday, so I might be staying an extra night." I closed my eyes, wondering if he was having this conversation from the house he shared with Rebecca, if she was in the next room perhaps preparing dinner or reading pregnancy books while her husband lied to his other wife about his location. "Take care of yourself," I said. "I love you too. I'll try to call tomorrow night, but if the meetings run late, don't worry." After he hung up, I sat in the silence of our house and began planning. Rebecca would arrive tomorrow afternoon, and by the time Marcus returned from his business trip, both of his wives would be waiting for him. But this wouldn't be a simple confrontation or emotional scene. This would be something much more devastating, a systematic dismantling of the life he'd built on lies, orchestrated by the two women he'd underestimated. The game was about to begin, and Marcus had no idea that his opponents had already started playing. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that made the whole world feel subdued and contemplative. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with questions and half-formed plans, but I woke with a clarity that surprised me. Today I would meet the other Miss Chen, and together we would begin to understand the full scope of my husband's double life. I spent the morning researching bigamy laws and private investigators, trying to understand the legal implications of Marcus's situation and our options for gathering evidence. The internet rabbit hole led me through forums for people who'd discovered similar betrayals, legal databases explaining the complexities of prosecuting bigamy across state lines, and private investigation services that specialized in uncovering hidden assets and secret lies. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock, and I opened it to find a petite Asian woman with shoulder-length black hair and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night to match my own. Rebecca Chen looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 32 or 33, with delicate features and the kind of practical beauty that came from someone who worked long shifts taking care of others. She carried a small overnight bag and wore jeans with a loose sweater that couldn't quite hide the gentle curve of her pregnancy. "You must be Sarah," she said, her voice the same one I'd heard on the phone but somehow more real, more immediate now that we were face to face. "And you're Rebecca," I replied, stepping aside to let her enter. "I'm so sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." We stood in my foyer for a moment, two women connected by the most bizarre of circumstances, trying to figure out how to navigate a situation that neither of us had ever imagined. Rebecca's eyes moved around the space, taking in the hardwood floors, the family photos on the console table, the evidence of a life that directly contradicted everything her husband had told her about his past. "This is really your house," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "You really live here with him?" I led her into the living room where I'd laid out copies of our marriage certificate, joint bank statements, insurance documents, and photo albums spanning our 9-year relationship. Rebecca set down her bag and pulled out similar documents from her own life with Marcus, spreading them across my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that shouldn't fit together but somehow did. The evidence was overwhelming and contradictory. 2 marriage certificates, both legal, both bearing Marcus Chen's signature but dated 5 years apart. 2 sets of joint financial accounts, 2 insurance policies, listing different wives as beneficiaries, 2 completely different versions of the same man's life documented in official records that shouldn't have been able to coexist. How is this possible? Rebecca asked, holding up her marriage certificate next to mine. I checked his background before we got married. There was no record of a previous marriage. I examined the documents more closely, noting subtle differences in the way Marcus had signed his name, slight variations in the personal information he'd provided, different social security numbers. I realized, pointing to the discrepancy. Look at this. The number on your marriage application is different from the one on mine. Rebecca leaned forward, her nursing training evident in the systematic way she began comparing every detail between our 2 sets of documents. Identity fraud, she said quietly. He's not just a bigamist, he's been using false identity documents to create multiple legal personas. The scope of Marcus's deception was staggering. He hadn't simply hidden a second marriage, he'd constructed an entirely false identity, complete with fabricated social security numbers, fake employment histories and forged documents that allowed him to legally marry while already being married. The level of premeditation and criminal sophistication required for such a scheme suggested that this wasn't an impulsive affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a carefully planned double life that had been years in the making. I need to show you something, Rebecca said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through photos. This is our house in Portland. She handed me the device, and I found myself looking at images of a craftsman-style home with a wraparound porch and large window. The interior photos showed warm wood floors, built-in bookshelves, and furniture that was completely different from our Connecticut home but somehow perfectly suited to the man I knew as my husband. What struck me most was how authentic this other life appeared. These weren't the hasty accommodations of a man keeping a mistress. This was a fully realized domestic existence. I saw photos of Marcus and Rebecca at restaurants, hiking trails, what appeared to be a wedding ceremony in a small church. In these images, Marcus looked genuinely happy, relaxed in a way I rarely saw him at home. He looks different with you, I said, studying a photo of Marcus laughing at something Rebecca had said during what appeared to be a romantic dinner. Different how? More present, more engaged. I handed back her phone, feeling a strange mix of hurt and curiosity. In our photos he always looks like he's thinking about something else. Rebecca scrolled through more images, pausing at one that made her intake breath sharply. Sarah, look at this. She showed me a photo of Marcus in what was obviously a home office, sitting at a desk with papers spread around him. In the background, partially visible, was a framed photograph. Can you zoom in on that picture frame? I asked. Rebecca enlarged the image, and we both stared at the photograph that Marcus had displayed in his Portland office. It was a professional headshot of a woman I didn't recognize, blonde, probably in her late 20s, with a bright smile and corporate attire. Who is that? Rebecca whispered. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. I think, I said slowly, that we need to consider the possibility that we're not the only 2 Mrs. Chens. The thought was so overwhelming that neither of us spoke for several minutes. If Marcus was capable of maintaining 2 separate marriages across state lines, each with different identities and elaborate cover stories, was it possible that there were more? The photograph in his Portland office suggested a level of organization that went beyond even the complex deception we'd already uncovered. We need to find her, Rebecca said finally, her voice carrying the determination of someone who'd realized that the betrayal might be even larger than they'd initially imagined. I pulled out my laptop and began reverse searching the image Rebecca had captured from the background of Marcus's Portland office photo. It took several attempts and different search engines, but eventually we found a match. The woman was Jennifer Walsh, a cardiologist at Seattle Medical Center, and according to her professional bio, she was married and lived in the greater Seattle area. Seattle is only 3 hours from Portland, Rebecca said quietly. And Marcus mentioned having clients in Seattle, I added, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form. He's taken several trips there over the past 2 years, always brief ones, usually just overnight. We spent the next hour researching Jennifer Walsh, finding social media profiles that had been set to private but showed enough public information to paint a picture of her life. She appeared to be in her early 30s, had graduated from medical school 4 years ago, and based on the timeline of her posts, had gotten married approximately 18 months ago. Her maiden name was Jennifer Richardson, I said, scanning through old professional listings, but she changed it to Walsh after marriage. The question is whether she's Jennifer Chen in her private life. Rebecca was already pulling up Washington state marriage records on her phone. If Marcus used the same pattern, false social security number, slightly altered personal information, there might be a record of a Jennifer Walsh Chen marriage in the Seattle area. The search took longer than our previous research, but eventually Rebecca found what we were looking for, a marriage certificate filed in King County, Washington, showing Jennifer Richardson marrying a Marcus Chen, whose personal details matched neither of my husband's previous identities, but followed the same pattern of falsification. 3 wives, I said, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. He has 3 wives, 3 that we know of, Rebecca corrected grimly. If he's been doing this systematically, there could be more. The magnitude of Marcus's deception was beyond anything I could have imagined. This wasn't a man who'd fallen in love with 2 women and couldn't choose between them. This was someone who'd made a lifestyle out of bigamous relationships, creating multiple identities and maintaining separate existences across the country. Each marriage appeared to follow a similar pattern: meet a professional woman in a city where he had business connections, court her with carefully crafted stories designed to appeal to her specific vulnerabilities, marry her using false documentation, then maintain the relationship through regular business trips that allowed him to rotate between his different lives. We have to contact her, Rebecca said, her hand unconsciously moving to her pregnant belly. Jennifer has a right to know what kind of man she married. I nodded, though part of me wondered how we'd even begin such a conversation. Calling someone to inform them that their husband was already married to 2 other women seemed like the kind of news that required delicate handling. But Rebecca was right. If Marcus had deceived Jennifer the same way he'd deceived us, she deserved to know the truth. There's something else we need to consider, I said slowly. If Marcus has been doing this for years, if he's built multiple identities and maintained several marriages simultaneously, this isn't just bigamy, this is a sophisticated criminal operation, identity fraud, tax evasion, possibly insurance fraud. The federal implications could be enormous. Rebecca's nursing background had given her experience with domestic violence situations, and her expression showed she understood the broader implications of what we'd discovered. Men who lead double lives this elaborate don't usually limit themselves to marriage. There are probably financial crimes, maybe other victims we don't know about. As afternoon turned to evening, we continued our research, building a comprehensive picture of Marcus's criminal activities. Each new discovery was more damaging than the last. We found evidence of multiple bank accounts under different names, credit cards that corresponded to his various identities, even what appeared to be separate investment portfolios, managed under his false persona. He's not just married to 3 women, I realized, studying the financial documents we'd uncovered. He's essentially stolen 3 different lives. Jennifer thinks she's married to a widowed pharmaceutical executive who's building a new life after loss. You think you're married to a man who overcame family tragedy to find love again. I think I'm married to a dedicated professional who travels for work but comes home to build a quiet suburban life. And each version of himself allows him to access our resources, our emotional support, our professional networks, Rebecca added. We're not just wives, we're unwitting accomplices in whatever larger scheme he's running. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple infidelity. Marcus had essentially created a criminal enterprise based on marriage fraud, using multiple wives to establish credit, build assets, and maintain different identities that could be used for various purposes. Each of us represented a different face he could present to the world, a different set of credentials and connections he could leverage for his benefit. Tomorrow, I said as Rebecca prepared to stay the night in our guest room, we're going to call Jennifer Wall, and then we're going to figure out how to introduce Marcus Chen to all of his wives at the same time. The plan that was forming in my mind was audacious, potentially dangerous, but absolutely necessary. Marcus had built his criminal empire on the assumption that his wives would never discover each other, that we were too isolated and trusting to uncover the truth. He was about to learn that he'd seriously underestimated the women he'd chosen to deceive. The reckoning was coming, and Marcus had no idea that his 3 wives were already working together to bring down the empire of lies he'd spent years constructing. Thursday morning found Rebecca and me sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by printouts, legal documents, and 2 laptops displaying the fruits of our late-night investigative work. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but neither of us seemed to notice, as we prepared for what might be the most difficult phone call either of us had ever made. Rebecca's pregnancy had made her nauseous, and I'd noticed her picking at the toast I'd made rather than eating it, her nervous energy too intense for proper nutrition. "I think I should make the call," Rebecca said, her finger hovering over Jennifer Walsh's work number at Seattle Medical Center. "As a nurse, I might have more credibility with another medical professional. She might be more willing to listen if she thinks it's a healthcare-related conversation initially." I nodded, though my stomach churned with anxiety about how Jennifer would react to learning that her 1.5-year marriage was built on complete fabrication. We'd rehearsed the conversation multiple times, trying to find words that would convey the impossible truth without sounding like elaborate revenge fantasy or mental breakdown. How do you tell someone that their husband doesn't exist, that the man they wake up next to every morning is a criminal using a false identity to commit systematic marriage fraud? Rebecca dialed the number with steady hands, though I could see the tension in her shoulders as the phone rang. "Walsh's office, this is Amanda speaking," came a professional voice through the speaker. "Hi Amanda, this is Rebecca Chen calling from Portland General Hospital. I'm a registered nurse, and I need to speak with Dr. Walsh about a patient safety issue that involves her personally." "It's quite urgent." The white lie felt necessary under the circumstances. We needed Jennifer to take the call, and mentioning a patient safety issue would ensure she spoke with us immediately, rather than requesting we schedule an appointment through proper channels. "Hold please, I'll see if Dr. Walsh is available." The hold music seemed to stretch forever, a generic instrumental version of something that might have once been a popular song. Rebecca and I exchanged glances, both of us aware that the next few minutes would either bring us one step closer to unraveling Marcus's criminal enterprise, or leave us with more questions and possibly a third woman who wouldn't believe our story. "This is Walsh," came a crisp, professional voice. "Amanda said you're calling about a patient safety issue." "Dr. Walsh, thank you for taking my call. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I'm calling about something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out. This concerns your husband Marcus." There was a pause, the kind of silence that suggested confusion rather than recognition. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My husband's name is Michael, not Marcus. Michael Walsh." Rebecca's eyes widened as she looked at me. Even the name was different this time. Marcus had created yet another identity for his Seattle marriage, another persona with another fabricated history. "Doc Walsh, I understand this is confusing, but I believe the man you know as Michael Walsh is actually named Marcus Chen, and he's been using false identity documents. He's currently married to at least 2 other women, including myself." The silence that followed was so long I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Jennifer finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled in the way of medical professionals delivering difficult diagnoses. "I'm going to need you to explain exactly what you're talking about, and I'm going to need proof." Rebecca launched into our story, describing how we'd discovered each other, the documentation we'd found, the pattern of false identities and fabricated history. As she spoke, I could hear Jennifer's breathing change through the phone, becoming shorter and more rapid as the implications of what she was hearing began to sink in. "You're telling me," Jennifer said slowly, "that my husband Michael is actually a man named Marcus, who's married to you in Portland and to another woman in Connecticut, using different social security numbers and fake documents for each marriage." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Rebecca confirmed, "and I know how insane it sounds, but I can send you documentation right now. Photos, marriage certificates, financial records. Sarah and I have been working together since yesterday to piece this together." "Sarah, his Connecticut wife," I said, speaking for the first time. "I'm Sarah Chen, married to Marcus Chen, For 9 years. Until Tuesday I had no idea either of you existed. Jennifer's laugh was sharp, brittle. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. Michael and I have been married for 18 months. We have joint bank accounts, a mortgage together, shared insurance policies. He works for a biomedical device company, travels for sales meetings. He's never mentioned being married before or having any family. What did he tell you about his past? Rebecca asked gently. That his parents died in a boating accident when he was in college, that he had no siblings, that he'd focused on his career and never found the right person to settle down with until he met me. Jennifer's voice was becoming strained. He said I was his first real love, his chance at the family he'd always wanted but never thought he'd have. The pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. Marcus didn't just create false identities. He crafted elaborate backstories designed to appeal to each woman's specific emotional needs. With Rebecca, he was the tragic widower rebuilding after loss. With me, he was the stable professional ready to build a quiet suburban life. With Jennifer, he was the orphaned workaholic finally ready to create the family he'd never had. Each story was perfectly calibrated to make us feel special, chosen, like we were healing something broken in him. Jennifer, I said carefully, I'm going to text you some photos and documents right now. Look at them while we're on the phone, and then tell us if the man in these pictures is your husband, Mike. I sent a series of images, our wedding photos, casual pictures of Marcus around our house, copies of our marriage certificate and joint financial statements. The silence stretched as Jennifer presumably examined the evidence that her husband was leading multiple lives. Oh my God, she whispered finally. Oh my God. That's him, that's Michael, but your wedding photos are dated 3 years before ours, and these financial documents show accounts I've never heard of. Her voice was rising now, shock giving way to anger. He's been lying to me about everything. Everything. There's more, Rebecca said gently. We think there might be other wives. We found evidence suggesting this has been going on for years, possibly with multiple women in different cities. Jennifer's response was a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Other wives? How many women has he done this to? How is this even possible? I pulled up the research we'd compiled overnight. The pattern analysis that suggested Marcus's criminal operation was far more extensive than even 3 marriages. Based on his travel patterns and the financial records we've found, we think he may have established relationships in Denver, Atlanta, and possibly Phoenix. We're still investigating, but the evidence suggests this is how he makes his living. Makes his living? Jennifer's voice was sharp with confusion. Think about it, Rebecca explained. 3 wives, 3 sets of joint bank accounts, 3 credit histories he can leverage, property he can buy using different identities, insurance policies with multiple beneficiaries, investment accounts under various names. He's essentially running a marriage-based financial fraud scheme. The implications were staggering. Marcus wasn't just a man who couldn't commit to one woman. He was a sophisticated criminal who used marriage as a tool for financial manipulation. Each wife represented a different revenue stream, a different set of assets he could access, a different identity he could use for various purposes. Our love, our trust, our emotional investment in our marriages had all been weaponized as part of an elaborate coning. I need to see all the evidence, Jennifer said, her medical training kicking in as she processed the shock. Every document, every photograph, every piece of proof you have, and then we need to figure out what to do about this. Jennifer, I said carefully, there's something else you should know. Rebecca is pregnant with his child. The silence that followed was profound. When Jennifer spoke again, her voice was hollow. Pregnant? We've been trying for 6 months. He said he wanted children more than anything. That starting a family with me was his greatest dream. He told me the same thing, Rebecca said quietly. And Sarah, how long has he been deflecting discussions about children with you? 3 years, I admitted. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He always said the timing wasn't right, that we should wait until his career was more established. The pattern was becoming clear. Marcus managed each relationship's timeline carefully, ensuring that major life events like pregnancy occurred in sequence rather than simultaneously. He'd been deflecting my interest in starting a family while actively trying to conceive with Rebecca, and now was attempting to get Jennifer pregnant while Rebecca was already expecting. The logistics alone suggested years of careful planning and manipulation. "We need to meet in person," Jennifer said, her voice gaining strength as the initial shock transformed into determination. "All three of us. I can fly to Connecticut this weekend, actually," I said, an idea beginning to form. "I think we should meet somewhere else. Somewhere Marcus would never expect to find all three of his wives together." Over the next hour we planned what we began calling the convergence. Jennifer would fly to Portland on Friday evening, and I would drive there Saturday morning. Rebecca would arrange for us to meet at her house, the home she shared with Marcus, while he was supposedly in Connecticut dealing with his other life. The symbolism was perfect, his Portland wife hosting a meeting of all his victims, in the very space where he'd built one of his elaborate deceptions. But our plan went beyond just meeting each other. We spent Thursday afternoon coordinating with a private investigator Rebecca had found, a former FBI agent named Patricia Hernandez, who specialized in financial crimes and identity fraud. Patricia had been fascinated by our case, explaining that marriage fraud operations of this sophistication were rare but not unheard of, and that building a solid evidence package was crucial for any legal action we might pursue. "The most important thing," Patricia explained during our conference call, "is documenting everything before he becomes aware that you've discovered his operation. Once he knows you're onto him, he'll likely disappear, liquidate assets, and possibly destroy evidence. We need to move quickly but carefully." Patricia had agreed to meet us in Portland on Saturday, bringing surveillance equipment and legal documents that would help us gather additional evidence while confronting Mark. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would invite Marcus to dinner at Rebecca's house, supposedly to celebrate Rebecca's pregnancy and discuss their future together. But when Marcus arrived, he would find not just his pregnant Portland wife, but both of his other wives, and a federal investigator ready to document his reaction. The shock value alone should prompt admissions, Patricia explained. Men running elaborate con games often can't resist explaining how clever they've been once they realize they've been caught. "We'll record everything with your consent, building a case that can be used for criminal prosecution and civil recovery." Thursday evening brought Marcus's usual call from his supposed business trip. I answered with the same casual affection I'd perfected over years of marriage, giving no hint that his Portland wife was sleeping in our guest room, or that we'd spent the day unraveling his criminal empire. "How was your day, sweetheart?" he asked, and I could hear what sounded like television in the background, probably the local news from whatever hotel room he was supposedly occupying. "Quiet day at home," I replied truthfully. "I've been working on a new project, doing some research." "How are the meetings going?" "Productive but exhausting. These hospital administrators want to review every detail of our proposal multiple times. I think we're making progress, but it's slow going." I wondered if he was actually in Portland, sitting in the house he shared with Rebecca, perhaps even in the same room where Rebecca and I had planned his downfall. The thought that he might be lying to me while physically present in the space where his other pregnant wife was planning his exposure had an almost poetic justice to it. "Will you be home tomorrow as planned?" I asked. "Should be. My flight lands around 6, so I'll probably be home by 8. I'm looking forward to a quiet weekend at home with my wife." The casual way he said "my wife," as if I were his only wife, as if Rebecca wasn't carrying his child 3,000 miles away, as if Jennifer wasn't building a life with the man she knew as Michael Walsh in Seattle, struck me as almost sociopathic in its casual cruelty. Marcus had perfected the art of compartmentalization, speaking to each of us as if we were his entire world while simultaneously maintaining two other worlds we knew nothing about. "I love you," I said, the words feeling strange but necessary for maintaining the deception. "Love you too, Sarah. Sleep well." After hanging up, I found Rebecca in the guest room, staring at ultrasound photos from her last prenatal appointment. The images showed a tiny profile, unmistakably human despite being barely 4 inches long. This baby, Marcus's child, would be born into a world where his or her father was a federal criminal whose crimes were finally catching up with him. "What are you going to do about the baby?" I asked gently, settling into the chair beside the. Rebecca traced the outline of the ultrasound image with her finger. "I don't know. I've been trying not to think about it because it's too overwhelming. This baby was conceived in love, at least from my side." I thought Marcus and I were building something real, something lasting. Now I find out the father is a criminal who's been lying about everything, including his name. The baby isn't responsible for Marcus's crimes, I said carefully. Whatever we decide to do about Marcus, that child is innocent. I know. It's just that everything I thought I knew about this pregnancy, about my marriage, about my future, has turned out to be a lie. I'm going to be a single mother raising the child of a man who might spend years in federal prison for identity fraud and bigamy. Rebecca set down the ultrasound photos and looked at me directly. How do I explain to a child that their father never actually existed, that the man I thought I married was just a character he created to manipulate me? The question hung in the air between us, one of many impossible challenges that Marcus's crimes had created. His deception hadn't just betrayed 3 women, it had potentially damaged a child who hadn't even been born yet, creating a legacy of lies that would have consequences for years to come. We'll figure it out, I said, though I had no idea how. All of us together. Marcus might have made this mess, but he doesn't get to determine how we clean it up. Friday passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. Jennifer's flight was scheduled to arrive in Portland at 7 p.m., and I would drive there Saturday morning, timing my arrival for early afternoon. Rebecca had spent the day arranging the logistics of our confrontation, coordinating with Patricia Hernandez and setting up the surveillance equipment that would document Marcus's reaction when he discovered that all 3 of his wives had found each other. The plan was for Rebecca to call Marcus Friday evening, inviting him to a special dinner Saturday night to celebrate their pregnancy and discuss nursery plans. The invitation would seem natural, even romantic, giving Marcus no reason to suspect that anything had changed in his carefully managed Portland life. Meanwhile, Jennifer and I would be positioned to document everything that happened when Marcus arrived to find his 3 wives waiting for him. I'm nervous about calling him, Rebecca admitted as we reviewed the plan one final time. I've never been good at lying, and now I have to convince him that everything is normal while planning his destruction. You don't have to lie, I pointed. You really do want to discuss the baby's future, and you really do want to talk about your relationship. You're just not telling him that Jennifer and I will be part of the conversation. Rebecca nodded, but I could see the anxiety in her face. She'd spent 3 years believing she was in love with a man who'd been systematically deceiving her, and now she had to pretend everything was fine while orchestrating his exposure. The emotional complexity of the situation was staggering. When Rebecca made the call, I listened from the kitchen as she spoke with Marcus in the warm, affectionate tone of a loving wife, excited about her pregnancy. I've been thinking about the nursery all day, she said, and I made your favorite dinner for tomorrow night. I thought we could talk about baby names and maybe start planning how we want to announce the pregnancy to your colleagues. Marcus's response was everything we'd hoped for, enthusiastic, loving, completely unsuspecting. He told Rebecca how much he'd missed her, how excited he was about the baby, how he couldn't wait to spend a quiet evening at home discussing their future together. The casual cruelty of his affection, knowing that he'd be flying home to another wife after this conversation, was almost breathtaking in its sociopathic calculation. Tomorrow at 7, Rebecca confirmed. I can't wait to see. After she hung up, Rebecca sat quietly for several minutes, processing what she'd just done. He sounded so genuine, she said finally. So excited about the baby, so loving. How does someone fake emotion that convincingly? Practice, I said grimly. Years and years of practice. Marcus has been perfecting these performances for longer than either of us realized. That evening, I helped Rebecca prepare for Jennifer's arrival, cleaning the guest room and stocking the refrigerator with food for what would likely be a very long and emotionally intense weekend. As I moved through Rebecca's house, I found myself cataloging the ways it differed from my Connecticut home, while still feeling unmistakably like a space Marcus inhabited. The Portland house reflected a different version of my husband's personality, more outdoorsy and adventurous than the quiet suburban professional I knew. There were hiking boots by the back door, trail maps pinned to a corkboard in the kitchen, photographs of Marcus and Rebecca at various Pacific Northwest landmarks. The man in these pictures looked genuinely happy, more relaxed and spontaneous than the Marcus I knew at home. He really does love you, I observed, studying a photograph of Marcus and Rebecca on what appeared to be a mountain hiking trail. I can see it in his face, which makes this whole situation even more twisted. Rebecca joined me in looking at the photograph. I think he loves all of us, in his way. That's what makes him so dangerous. He's not just using us for money or convenience. He's genuinely emotionally invested in multiple relationships simultaneously, which allows him to be convincing because the feelings are real, even if everything else is fake. The insight was disturbing but accurate. Marcus wasn't a cold-blooded con artist using emotion to manipulate victims. He was someone who'd found a way to compartmentalize his feelings, genuinely caring for multiple women while lying to all of them about fundamental aspects of his identity and their relationship. The emotional investment made his deception more effective because it allowed him to be authentic within the boundaries of each fabricated persona. Jennifer's flight arrived on schedule, and Rebecca and I drove to Portland International Airport in nervous silence. Neither of us was sure what to expect from our first in-person meeting with Marcus's third wife, the woman who knew him as Michael Walsh and had no idea that her marriage was part of an elaborate criminal enterprise. We spotted Jennifer immediately as she emerged from the security checkpoint. She was taller than I'd expected, probably 5'8", with blonde hair pulled back in a professional bun, and the kind of confident posture that came from years of medical training. She wore dark jeans and a navy blazer, carrying a small rolling suitcase and scanning the crowd with the focused attention of someone looking for strangers she'd only spoken to on the phone. "Dr. Wall." Rebecca called out, and Jennifer turned toward us with an expression that mixed curiosity, anxiety, and the kind of clinical assessment that medical professionals brought to difficult situations. "Rebecca," Jennifer said, extending her hand as she approached, "and you must be Sarah." We shook hands with the awkward formality of people united by the most bizarre circumstances. Three women whose lives had been connected by one man's systematic deception. Jennifer was younger than I'd expected, probably 31 or 32, with green eyes and the kind of precise speech patterns that suggested years of presenting medical information to colleagues and patients. "How was your flight?" I asked as we walked toward the parking garage, all of us trying to navigate the surreal social dynamics of the situation. "Long," Jennifer replied. "I spent most of it reviewing the documents you sent and trying to process the fact that my entire marriage is apparently a fraud. It's not exactly typical airline reading material." During the drive to Rebecca's house, we filled Jennifer in on the additional evidence we'd gathered since our phone conversation, the pattern analysis that suggested Marcus had been running marriage fraud operations for years, and the plan for Saturday evening's confrontation. Jennifer listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to processing complex medical information, quickly and accurately. "So tomorrow night, when Marcus arrives for what he thinks is a romantic dinner with his pregnant wife, he'll find all three of his wives waiting for him, along with a federal investigator and surveillance equipment," Jennifer summarized. "And you're hoping shock will prompt him to confess to crimes that could result in decades in federal prison." "That's the plan," Rebecca confirmed. "Patricia thinks his personality type makes him likely to try to explain himself rather than simply deny everything. Narcissistic criminals often can't resist demonstrating how clever they've been." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "From a psychological perspective, that makes sense. Marcus has always enjoyed explaining complex situations, breaking down problems step by step. It's one of the things I found attractive about him initially, his ability to analyze and articulate complicated scenarios." As we pulled into Rebecca's driveway, I felt a strange sense of completion. Three women who'd never met, brought together by one man's elaborate deception, united in our determination to hold him accountable for crimes that had damaged all of our lives. Tomorrow, Marcus Chen would discover that his carefully constructed world of lies was about to collapse around him. The evening stretched ahead of us, our last night before the confrontation that would change everything. Rebecca's living room became our war room that Friday evening, with legal documents spread across the coffee table, laptops displaying financial evidence, and three women planning the downfall of the man who'd deceived us all. Jennifer had brought additional documentation from her Seattle life with Marcus, including bank statements that revealed yet another pattern of financial manipulation. "Look at this," Jennifer said, pulling up her online banking on her laptop. "Michael convinced me to consolidate my student loans and credit card debt into a joint account 6 months after we got married. He said it would improve our credit score and simplify our finance." Rebecca and I studied the statements, recognizing a pattern we'd seen in our own financial arrangements with Marcus. In each case, he'd gradually gained access to our individual assets, encouraging us to combine resources under the guise of building a stronger financial foundation as married couples. He did the same thing with me, Rebecca convinced me to refinance my condo and add his name to the deed, because married couples got better interest rates. Then he suggested we use the equity to invest in his pharmaceutical consulting business. Pharmaceutical consulting business, I looked up sharply. Marcus told me he was considering starting a biomedical consulting firm, but that it was still in the planning stages. Jennifer Frank. He told me he was already running a successful biomedical device consulting company, that it was how he could afford to travel so much for work while maintaining a flexible schedule. The pieces were clicking together in a pattern that was both brilliant and terrifying. Marcus hadn't just created multiple identities for marriage fraud, he'd built an entire fake business empire that existed in different stages of development depending on which wife he was talking to. With me, it was a future plan that explained his business knowledge, but didn't require immediate investment. With Rebecca, it was a growing venture that justified using her home equity for startup capital. With Jennifer, it was an established company that explained his wealth and travel schedule. He's been using our assets to fund a business that doesn't actually exist, I realized. Or if it exists, it's probably just a shell company for laundering money from his marriage fraud operation. Patricia Hernandez arrived while we were still processing this revelation, bringing surveillance equipment and a briefcase full of legal documents. She was a compact woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of calm competence that came from decades of investigating complex financial crime. "Ladies," she said, settling into Rebecca's armchair and pulling out a digital recorder, "I've spent today running background checks on all the identities Marcus has been using, and what I found is going to shock you." Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents. Marcus Chen, the identity he uses with Sarah, appears to be his original legal identity. Born in San Francisco, legitimate social security number, real birth certificate. The other identities, the Marcus Chen he uses with Rebecca and the Michael Walsh he uses with Jennifer, are sophisticated fabrications, built using identity theft techniques. Identity theft, Jennifer leaned forward. "You mean he stole someone else's personal information?" "Not exactly. He used what's called synthetic identity theft, where criminals combine real and fake information to create new identities that can pass credit checks and background verification. The social security numbers he's been using belong to deceased individuals whose deaths weren't properly reported to the Social Security Administration." The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just committed bigamy, he'd built his criminal operation using the identities of dead people, creating fake personas that were sophisticated enough to fool banks, government agencies, and background check companies. "There's more," Patricia continued. "I found evidence of at least 2 additional identities he's been developing. David Kim in Denver and Robert Martinez in Phoenix. Both have recently opened bank accounts and applied for credit cards, but neither appears to be married yet." 5 identities, Rebecca said quietly. "He's planning to expand his operation." "It gets worse," Patricia said grimly. "The pharmaceutical consulting business he's been describing to various degrees exists, but it's primarily a vehicle for money laundering. He's been using the combined assets from his 3 marriages to fund investments under different identities, then claiming business profits when he moves money between accounts." I felt sick as the scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise became clear. He hadn't just deceived 3 women into marriage, he'd built a sophisticated financial fraud operation that used our emotions, our trust, and our assets as raw materials for an elaborate money laundering scheme. Every dollar we'd contributed to joint accounts, every asset we'd combined in the name of building stronger marriages, had become part of a criminal enterprise we'd unknowingly helped fund. "What kind of prison time are we talking about?" Jennifer asked with clinical directness. "Identity fraud alone carries up to 15 years per count, and he's got multiple counts across state lines. Add bigamy, money laundering and tax evasion, and we're looking at potential decades in federal prison," Patricia explained. "But conviction requires solid evidence and victim cooperation. That's where tomorrow night comes in." Patricia outlined the surveillance plan with military precision. She would position herself outside Rebecca's house with long-range audio equipment, while we wore concealed recording devices inside. The goal was to capture Marcus's admissions on multiple recording systems, creating redundant evidence that would be admissible in federal court. The key is letting him talk, Patricia emphasized. Don't accuse him immediately. Let him try to explain the situation. Narcissistic criminals often can't resist demonstrating their cleverness, and his explanations will likely constitute confessions to multiple federal crimes. As we reviewed the plan, I found myself thinking about the Marcus I'd married 9 years ago, the man who'd seemed like everything I'd been looking for in a partner. That version of Marcus, stable, reliable, focused on building a quiet suburban life, had been just one performance among many, a character he'd created to appeal to my specific desires and vulnerabilities. I keep wondering, I said to the group, which version of himself is real? Is there an authentic Marcus Chen underneath all these personas? Or has he become so committed to his various characters that he's lost track of who he actually is? From what I've seen in similar cases, Patricia replied, long-term con artists often become their con. The boundaries between performance and reality blur until they genuinely believe their own lies. Marcus might actually love all three of you, while simultaneously viewing you as Marcus in his criminal operation. The psychological complexity was disturbing. Marcus wasn't a cold, calculating criminal using emotion as a tool. He was someone who'd found a way to genuinely care for multiple people while systematically betraying them all. The emotional investment made his crimes more effective because it allowed him to be authentic within the confines of each fabricated relationship. Jennifer had been quiet for most of Patricia's briefing, studying the evidence with the focused attention she probably brought to difficult medical cases. There's something I haven't told you, she said finally. Something that might be relevant to tomorrow night. We all turned to look at her, and I could see the conflict in her expression as she decided whether to share whatever she'd been holding back. Marcus has been talking about wanting to expand his business into other markets. He's mentioned potentially relocating to a larger city where there would be more opportunities for growth. Jennifer paused, choosing her words carefully. Last month he asked me how I'd feel about moving to Los Angeles. He said there was a potential business partnership opportunity that could make us financially secure for life. Los Angeles, Patricia repeated, making notes. That fits the pattern. He's probably planning to establish another identity there, possibly marry another woman and expand his operation to the West Coast. The revelation added urgency to our confrontation plan. If Marcus was preparing to expand his criminal enterprise, tomorrow night might be our only opportunity to stop him before he created additional victims. Once he realized his current operation had been exposed, he would likely disappear, liquidate his assets, and start over somewhere else with new identities and new targets. He's been planning this for months, Rebecca said, her hand unconsciously moving to her pregnant belly. While I've been preparing for our baby, while Jennifer's been planning their future in Seattle, while Sarah's been building what she thought was a stable marriage, he's been laying the groundwork to abandon all of us and start over with new victims. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Marcus had been simultaneously planning futures with each of us, while actively preparing to discard us all in favor of new opportunities. The pregnancy that Rebecca thought represented his commitment to their relationship was just another complication he'd eventually planned to escape. As Friday evening turned into night, we finalized every detail of Saturday's confrontation. Jennifer would arrive at Rebecca's house first, around 5 p.m., giving us time to position surveillance equipment and prepare psychologically for what would likely be the most difficult conversation any of us had ever had. I would arrive around 6:30, just before Marcus was expected for dinner. Patricia would coordinate from outside, monitoring the recordings and prepared to call federal agents if Marcus became violent or attempted to flee. We'd researched his personality and behavior patterns enough to believe he would try to talk his way out of the situation rather than resort to physical confrontation. But we couldn't be certain how someone would react when years of careful deception suddenly collapsed. Remember, Patricia emphasized as we concluded our planning session, the goal is evidence collection, not emotional satisfaction. Let him explain himself. Let him try to justify what he's done. Every word he says will help build the case against him. That night, as Jennifer settled into the second guest room and Rebecca tried to sleep despite her pregnancy-related discomfort, I lay awake in the darkness, thinking about the conversation that awaited us. Tomorrow, Marcus would discover that his 3 wives had found each other, that his criminal operation had been exposed, and that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. But more than that, tomorrow 3 women who'd been systematically deceived and manipulated would finally get answers to questions we'd been afraid to ask. Who was Marcus Chen really? How long had he been running marriage fraud operations? How many other women had he targeted? And perhaps most importantly, would confronting him finally give us the closure we needed to rebuild our lives from the wreckage of his deception? The reckoning was less than 24 hours away, and Marcus had no idea that his 3 wives were already united against him. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharp and urgent. By 6:15, Jennifer and I were positioned in Rebecca's living room, surveillance equipment hidden throughout the house, and Patricia monitoring from her van parked strategically down the street. Rebecca moved through her kitchen with nervous energy, putting finishing touches on the dinner she'd prepared for what Marcus believed would be a romantic evening celebrating their pregnancy. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Rebecca had actually prepared Marcus's favorite meal, salmon with herb butter and roasted vegetables, the same dish she'd made for dozens of intimate dinners during their 3-year relationship. Tonight, though, the familiar ritual of cooking for her husband felt like preparing a last meal for a condemned man. "He just texted," Rebecca announced, checking her phone with hands that trembled slightly. "Running a few minutes late, but he'll be here by 7:15. Jennifer and I exchanged glances from our positions on the couch, both of us wearing the wireless recording devices Patricia had provided. The plan was simple in concept but emotionally complex in execution. We would remain hidden until Marcus had settled in, then reveal ourselves systematically, allowing him to process each shock before delivering the next one. "Remember," I said quietly, "let him talk, let him try to explain. Every word he says is evidence." The sound of a car in the driveway sent all 3 of us into final preparation. Rebecca smoothed her dress, a blue maternity outfit that Marcus had complimented just 2 weeks earlier, while Jennifer and I moved to the kitchen where we'd remain hidden until Rebecca gave us the signal. The front door opened with the familiar sound of Marcus's key in the lock, followed by his voice calling out the same greeting he'd used hundreds of times before. "Honey, I'm home. Something smells incredible." From the kitchen I could hear Rebecca's response, her voice warm with the kind of affection that came naturally after years of loving someone, even when that love had been built on lies. "Perfect timing. I just took everything out of the oven." Marcus's footsteps moved through the house with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had no reason to suspect that anything had changed in his carefully managed Portland life. "You look beautiful," he said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in his voice as he presumably kissed Rebecca hello. "Pregnancy suits you." "Thank you," Rebecca replied. "I have something special planned for tonight. Something I think will surprise you." The casual conversation continued for several minutes, Marcus describing his supposed business trip while Rebecca guided him toward the dining room, where she'd set the table for what he believed would be an intimate dinner for 2. Their voices carried the easy rhythm of a couple comfortable with each other, 2 people who'd built what they thought was a life together. "Before we eat," Rebecca said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, "I need to tell you something. About our future. About the baby, about our relationship." "Of course," Marcus replied, and I could hear the affection in his voice. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about family," Rebecca continued, "about the importance of honesty in relationships, about making sure our child grows up understanding the truth about their parent." There was a pause, the kind of silence that suggested Marcus was processing something unexpected in Rebecca's tone. "Is everything all right? You sound serious." "I am serious," Rebecca said. "Marcus, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything." From the kitchen, Jennifer and I could hear the scrape of a chair as Marcus presumably settled at the dining room table. His voice, when it came, carried the first hint of concern. "Rebecca, you're worrying me. Is something wrong with the baby?" "The baby is fine," Rebecca said clearly. "But our marriage isn't. Our marriage is a lie, Marcus. Your entire identity is a lie." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, even what might have been Patricia's van running outside. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "I think you do," Rebecca said, and I could hear the strength building in her voice. I know about Sarah Chen in Connecticut. I know about Jennifer Walsh in Seattle. I know about the false social security numbers and the fake business consultancy and the money laundering operation you've been running using our combined assets. Another silence, this one longer and heavy. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed completely, losing its warmth and taking on the flat, calculating tone of someone whose cover had been blown. How long have you known? Since Tuesday, Rebecca replied. When your other wife called looking for her husband. Other wife, Marcus repeated slowly. Which one? The casual way he said it, as if having multiple wives was a logistical problem rather than a federal crime, sent chills through me. Jennifer and I looked at each other, both recognizing that we were hearing the real Marcus Chen for the first time, the man behind all the carefully crafted personas. That would be me, I said, stepping into the dining room with Jennifer close behind. The look on Marcus's face was worth every sleepless hour I'd spent planning this moment. His expressions cycled through confusion, recognition, shock, and finally a kind of cold assessment as he realized the scope of what had been discovered. He looked from me to Jennifer to Rebecca, calculating odds and considering options with the mechanical precision of someone whose world had just collapsed. Sarah, he said finally, his voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances. And Dr. Jennifer Walsh, I presume. Actually, Jennifer said with clinical precision, it's Dr. Jennifer Chen, according to the marriage certificate you forged using a stolen identity, though I suppose that makes me Dr. Jennifer Chen Walsh Richardson, depending on which of your personalities I was married to. Marcus leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since we'd known him, his carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the expression of someone who'd been caught in an elaborate game, and was almost relieved to stop playing. How much do you know? He asked, directing the question to all three of us. Everything, I replied. The false identities, the money laundering, the plans to expand to Los Angeles, the other potential victims you've been cultivating in Denver and Phoenix. Marcus's smile widened slightly. Denver and Phoenix, you have been thorough. We had help, Rebecca said. Federal investigators tend to be quite good at uncovering financial fraud operations. For the first time, Marcus's composure faltered completely. His face went pale, and I could see his hands begin to shake slightly, as the legal implications of discovery by federal investigators began to sink in. Federal investigators, he repeated quietly. Patricia Hernandez, former FBI, current private investigator specializing in identity fraud and marriage-based financial crimes, Jennifer said with the kind of precise detail that medical professionals brought to difficult diagnoses. She's been documenting your criminal enterprise for the past 48 hours. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and consequences. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange mixture of defeat and what almost sounded like pride. How did you figure it out? I was so careful with the compartmentalization, the separate identities, the travel schedules. You made one mistake, I said. You listed me as your emergency contact on Rebecca's phone. When she had a medical scare, and tried to call your emergency contact, she reached your other wife instead of a colleague or family member. One phone number, Marcus said, shaking his head slightly. After years of maintaining completely separate identities, I got lazy with one phone number. That's how it always happens, Rebecca said. Criminals get overconfident, start cutting corners, make small mistakes that unravel everything. Marcus looked at Rebecca with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that might have been genuine regret mixed with admiration. You've done quite well for yourself, all of you. Most victims never figure out they're victims, let alone coordinate a federal investigation. Victims, Jennifer repeated sharply. Is that how you see us, as victims in your criminal enterprise? No, Marcus said, and for a moment his voice carried something that sounded almost like sincerity. You were never just victims. I loved all of you. I still love all of you. That's what made this so complicated. The admission hung in the air between us, a confession that was somehow both heartbreaking and infuriating. Marcus genuinely believed he'd loved us while systematically deceiving us, using our emotions as tools in an elaborate financial fraud scheme. You have a funny way of showing love, I said. Identity fraud, bigamy, money laundering, planning to abandon us all for new targets in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles plan wasn't about abandoning you, Marcus said, leaning forward with the earnestness of someone trying to explain a complex concept. It was about expansion, creating enough revenue streams to support all of my families properly. Families, Rebecca said, flatly. You mean your criminal operation? I mean my wives, my relationships, my responsibilities, Marcus insisted. Do you think this was easy, managing 3 households, 3 sets of emotional needs, 3 different lives? I was working constantly to keep everyone happy, everyone provided by stealing identities and laundering money, Jennifer pointed out, by creating opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise, Marcus corrected. Sarah, your freelance writing business expanded significantly after we got married, because you had financial stability and could take on more selective, higher-paying projects. Rebecca, you were able to buy your house and start planning for a family because my income gave you security. Jennifer, you were able to focus on your medical career without worrying about student loan payments because we consolidated your debt. The twisted logic of his justification was almost impressive in its scope. Marcus had convinced himself that his criminal activities were actually beneficial to his victims, that the financial fraud was a service he provided to women who needed stability and support. So you're saying we should thank you, I said, for stealing our identities and using our assets to fund your criminal enterprise. I'm saying, Marcus replied, that everyone benefited from the arrangement. You got financial security and emotional support. I got the companionship and partnership I needed. The system worked, until it didn't, Rebecca said, until your criminal operation was exposed and we discovered that our entire marriages were fraudulent. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering her words. The marriages weren't fraudulent, he said finally. The feelings were real, the relationships were real, the legal framework was complicated. Complicated, Jennifer repeated. That's one way to describe federal crime. The legal issues are secondary to the emotional reality, Marcus insisted. I loved all of you, I provided for all of you, I was a good husband to all of you within the constraints of the situation. The constraints of the situation, I said, being that you were already married to other women when you married each of us, among other constraints. Yet, the casual way he admitted to bigamy, as if it were a minor technicality rather than a serious crime, was both fascinating and horrifying. Marcus had so thoroughly rationalized his behavior that he genuinely didn't seem to understand why we were upset about being deceived. Marcus, Rebecca said, gently, do you understand that what you've done is illegal, that identity fraud and bigamy are federal crimes that carry decades in prison? I understand the legal framework, Marcus replied. I also understand that the emotional and financial reality of our relationships transcends legal technicalities. Legal technicalities, Jennifer said, with disbelief. You're talking about federal crimes as if they're parking tickets. I'm talking about bureaucratic obstacles to human happiness, Marcus said, his voice taking on the passionate tone of someone defending a deeply held belief. Marriage laws are arbitrary constructs designed to limit human relationships. I found a way to provide love and stability to multiple women simultaneously. The fact that bureaucratic systems can't accommodate that reality doesn't make it morally wrong. The moment of insight was chilling. Marcus hadn't just committed crimes, he'd developed an entire philosophical framework that justified his criminal behavior as morally superior to legal alternatives. He genuinely believed that his marriage fraud operation was a service to society, a way of optimizing human relationships beyond the constraints of conventional law. And the money laundering, I asked. How does stealing our assets fit into your philosophy of human optimization? Resource consolidation, Marcus said, matter-of-factly, combining assets from multiple income streams to create investment opportunities that benefited everyone involved. The pharmaceutical consulting business generated returns that supported all 3 households. The pharmaceutical consulting business that doesn't actually exist, Rebecca pointed out. It exists as a legal framework for investment activities, Marcus corrected. The fact that it doesn't operate in traditional pharmaceutical consulting doesn't make it fraudulent. We stared at him in amazement. Marcus had created elaborate justifications for every aspect of his criminal enterprise, from identity fraud, to money laundering to bigamy. In his mind, he wasn't a criminal, he was an innovative relationship entrepreneur who'd found creative solutions to the limitations of conventional marriage and finance. Marcus, I said carefully, do you understand that we're not going to continue these relationships? That your criminal operation is over. He looked at me with genuine confusion. Why would you want to end relationships that were working? We were all happy. We were all provided. The only thing that's changed is that you've discovered information about the legal structure, but the emotional reality remains the same. The emotional reality, Jennifer said, with clinical precision, is that you've been systematically lying to us about fundamental aspects of your identity and our relationships. Trust is the foundation of any marriage, and trust is exactly what you've destroyed. I've protected you from unnecessary complications, Marcus insisted. Would your lives have been better if you'd known about the legal complexities from the beginning? Would you have been happier worrying about identity documentation and interstate marriage law? We would have been happier, Rebecca said firmly, knowing the truth about the man we married and the relationships we were building. Marcus shook his head as if we were children refusing to understand a simple concept. The truth is that I loved all of you and provided for all of you, and created stable, supportive relationships that made everyone involved happier and more secure. The rest is just paperwork. The doorbell rang, interrupting our surreal conversation. Patricia Hernandez had clearly decided that she'd heard enough to justify moving to the next phase of the plan. Through the front window, I could see federal agents taking positions around the house. Marcus, I said gently, I think your paperwork problems are about to become much more immediate. He followed my gaze to the window, taking in the federal agents, the official vehicles, the reality that his criminal operation had been thoroughly documented and was now being shut down by law enforcement. For the first time since we'd confronted him, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. You really called federal investigators, he said almost admiringly. I underestimated all of you. Yes, Rebecca said simply. The federal agents were professional and efficient, arresting Marcus on charges of identity fraud, money laundering, and bigamy, while reading him his rights in the dining room where he'd expected to have a romantic dinner celebrating his unborn child. Throughout the process, Marcus maintained his strange calm, as if he were observing someone else's arrest rather than experiencing his own. As they led him away, Marcus looked back at the three of us one final time. This doesn't change how I feel about any of you, he said, and it doesn't change the fact that we had real relationships, real love, real happiness together. After the door closed behind him, the three of us sat in Rebecca's living room in stunned silence, processing what we'd just experienced. The man we'd each married had turned out to be even stranger than we'd imagined, not just a criminal but someone who'd developed an elaborate philosophical framework that painted his crimes as acts of love and service. I keep thinking, Jennifer said finally, that somewhere underneath all the lies and justifications, there might have been a real person who genuinely cared about us. There was, Rebecca said, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. That's what makes this so complicated. The emotions were real, even if everything else was fake. The emotions were real for us, I corrected. For Marcus, I think the emotions were just another tool in his criminal operation, another way to manipulate us into supporting his lifestyle. Over the following months, as federal prosecutors built their case and we worked with victim advocates to untangle the financial damage Marcus had caused, we learned the full scope of his criminal enterprise. He'd been running marriage fraud operations for nearly 15 years, targeting professional women in cities where he could establish business connections. We were his longest-running victims, but far from his only one. The pharmaceutical consulting business had been a shell company used to launder money from various fraud schemes, including insurance fraud, tax evasion, and investment scams that went far beyond his marriage-based operation. Marcus Chen wasn't just a bigamist, he was a sophisticated criminal who'd built an entire career around deceiving people who trusted him. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Marcus genuinely believed his own justification. Psychological evaluations conducted during his trial revealed someone who'd convinced himself so thoroughly of his moral superiority that he couldn't understand why his victims were upset about being deceived. In his mind, he'd provided a service, creating stable relationships and financial security for women who needed both. The trial lasted 6 months, and resulted in Marcus being sentenced to 23 years in federal prison on multiple counts of identity fraud, money laundering, and bigamy. He showed no remorse during sentencing, maintaining that his only crime was loving too many people in a society that couldn't accommodate his capacity for multiple relationships. Rebecca gave birth to a healthy daughter 8 months after Marcus's arrest,
naming her Hope because she represented a future free from the lies that had defined her marriage. Jennifer moved back to Portland to be closer to Rebecca and me, the three of us having formed an unlikely but strong friendship based on our shared experience of surviving Marcus's deception. I returned to Connecticut and rebuilt my life from the ground up, selling the house that had been contaminated by Marcus's lies, and starting over in a downtown apartment where I could focus on my writing without the constant reminders of my fraudulent marriage. The financial recovery took years, but the emotional recovery took longer. The most difficult part wasn't anger or betrayal. It was accepting that someone could love multiple people genuinely while simultaneously destroying their lives systematically. Marcus had taught us that love and manipulation weren't mutually exclusive, that someone could provide real emotional support while committing devastating crimes against the same people they claimed to care about. But we survived. We rebuilt. We learned to trust again, carefully and with better understanding of how sophisticated manipulation could be. And most importantly, we learned that even when your entire life turns out to be built on lies, you can still find truth in the relationships you build with people who understand exactly what you've survived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.